Okay, everybody, we're back for part two of our chapter 6 lecture on the skeletal system. So we're going to get into the skeleton itself. We're going to zoom out a bit. So the actual adult skeleton has 206 bones. It says on average because there are some people that are missing a few of those bones, and there are some people that have some extra bones that not everyone has. So we break our skeleton into two primary segments. We have our axial skeleton, which is down the center. So that's going to be our skull, our facial bones, the bones in our ear. Our hyoid will highlight the vertebral column and our thoracic cage. That's the axial skeleton. And then everything else is the appendicular skeleton. So everything that you see in yellow here is part of the axial skeleton. Everything you see in green is the appendicular skeleton. And so when you take a look at this lecture, it may seem a bit overwhelming or like it's a giant lecture, but don't let that stress you out. I don't need you to know every single bone in the body. I will be sending out a list of bones that will kind of highlight, and throughout the lecture, I'll kind of mention whether it's something you definitely need to know or don't need to know. But for the most part, don't spend a large majority of your time trying to memorize your skeleton. Certainly, for those of you that are pursuing something in the allied health field, if you're going to be taking A&P1 and A&P2, knowing the bones is definitely something that you're going to be required to do. So this is a good time to start getting familiar with them. So our appendicular skeleton is going to be our arms and our legs, as well as our two girdles. So we have our pectoral girdle and pelvic girdle. And so that's kind of where two areas that are like kind of attached or connected to the body. So our pectoral girdle for our upper body, our pelvic girdle for our lower body. We have four different bone shapes. Long, which we talked about in our endochondral ossification and compact versus spongy bone. We have short bones, we have flat bones, and irregular bones. So a long bone is going to be longer than we are wide. So like our humerus and our femur are two examples of some of our biggest long bones. Short bones are really about kind of like a square more than anything. So about as wide as they are long. And so bones in our wrist and ankle fit that description. So there's not a ton of short bones, but those are two good examples. We also have flat bones like our sternum. They're going to be relatively thin, so sternum and skull, and this is where a lot of our bone marrow is contained, or our red bone marrow specifically. And then finally, irregular bones, which don't really fit into any of the other shapes, such as our vertebrae, a lot of our facial bones you'll see. And so they kind of we lump everything else together. So your skeletal terminology, this you should make sure you know. You don't necessarily need to memorize the examples, but that's a good way to reinforce the definition. But you should at least know what the term and definition mean. So a foramen is going to be a hole. The example we use here is the foramen magnum, which we'll see in a few slides, because that is the opening for our brainstem as it turns into our spinal cord exiting the skull. The term fossa is for a depression. So our glenoid fossa, that's where we have a depression in our pectoral girdle where our shoulder can fit into. So that's where our humerus fits into to create our shoulder. A process is a projection. The mastoid process, if you poke behind your ears, is the part of your skull that kind of sticks down into a point right behind both ears. That's your mastoid processes. A condyle is going to be something with a smooth, rounded end. A meatus or a canal is going to mean a canal-like passageway. So our external auditory meatus, that's kind of the opening for our ears. And then a tubercle or tuberosity is more or less going to mean a lump of bone. So the greater tubercle we find on a few different bones, like our femur and our humerus, which is an attachment point for muscles. Or you can feel your tibial tuberosity if you go below your kneecaps and you feel that bump kind of in the top middle portion of your shin. That's your tibial tuberosity. Okay, so first we're going to talk more about the axial skeleton. So we said it's our skull, our vertebral column, and the thoracic cage. The skull itself has 22 bones divided into those that encase our brain and those that form our face. So the brain case, which makes up our cranial cavity, is going to have 8 different cranial bones that protect our brain. And then our face has a total of 14 facial bones. So put that together, you get 22 total bones in the face. So most of our facial bones, 13 of the 14, are solidly connected to form our facial structure. Our mandible, which is our jaw, is the one exception, and it's kind of a freely movable joint. We have our temporomandibular joint. That's our joint that makes our jaw. It's kind of freely movable against the rest of the skull. Our facial bones don't have a lot of movement, but the jaw itself does. We also have 6 total bones for our ears, 3 for each ear. We won't talk about those much now. We'll have a chapter specific to the senses. And so we have bones involved in generating sound and interpreting sound. Our cranial sutures, these are going to be immovable joints. So we have 4 main sutures. Oh, sorry, I thought we were going to hit the picture, not quite yet. So we have our coronal suture, our sagittal suture, our lambdoid suture, and our squamous suture. So these are all areas that used to be soft spots or fontanelles as infants, and the sections end up fusing together. So we'll touch back on this when we can actually see the picture of the skull. Okay, a few different cranial bones. These ones you kind of should know because they line up with the different lobes or portions of the brain. And so let me come down this way. Well, we'll go ahead. We'll go through the words part of it, and then we'll walk through the skull itself. So our frontal bone is going to be the anterior part of the cranium, and so that's our forehead.